That's right. The only reason that Magma Chamber was canceled and the reason why we don't have a ranked 1v1 ladder in League of Legends today is just... League of Legends is a bit of an oddity in the video game world. It's one of the most popular PC games on the face of the planet, even though a huge amount of its player base finds playing the game incredibly frustrating. But what might be even more odd is that frustration players feel doesn't really come from anything related to the gameplay itself. In a vacuum, League is really fun. It's quick, creative, it has loads of room for skill expression in its gameplay. But because League was built to be a 5 versus 5 team-oriented, competitive game, well, that's where the frustration comes in. From teammates leaving in the middle of a game to jerks calling you all sorts of slurs in chat for God knows what reason, there's an endless number of ways that your experience can be ruined whenever you queue up for a ranked match. Any individual player only makes up 1/5 of their squad, leaving plenty of opportunity for unsavory characters to come in and ruin their day. But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if there was a game mode in League and a ranked ladder accompanying it, where all you had to worry about was your own performance and nothing else? Well, League fans were incredibly close to getting exactly that for a brief moment in history before Riot yanked it away from them at the 11th hour for one of the most ridiculous reasons you'll ever hear. We're going to talk about that entire story today, but first, before we jump in, I have to give a quick shout out to our sponsor. This video is brought to you by Surfshark VPN. Now, you guys know the deal at this point. There's a lot of bad people out there that want to get a hold of your data, jerks that want to region lock content preventing you from seeing it, but you're a smart person, which is why you watch my videos and why you also use a VPN. VPNs, of course, allow you to mask your IP address, giving you the freedom to browse the internet safely and securely. They also let you hop countries instantly, so you can see region-locked content on all your favorite streaming sites. They're a really neat service that everyone should be using nowadays, but when it comes to the best of all the VPNs out there, nobody beats out Surfshark. Surfshark are one of the fastest and easiest providers to use. They give you features nobody else does, like letting you use a single account on an unlimited number of devices. They also don't monitor any logs or track or store what you do online, but what really makes them the best out there is they like my videos and they want to give you guys a great deal. If you click the link in the description down below or go to surfshark.com/gbay99, you can get 83% off a subscription plus 3 months free, the best deal that they currently offer. Just use code GBay99 at checkout. I'm really happy to have Surfshark as a continued partner on our channel, so shout out to them for sponsoring us and supporting our content. They are a legitimately great service, so please go ahead and check them out. When League of Legends was first released, one of the biggest ways Riot tried to market the game was by showcasing that League allowed you to play on more than just one map. At the time of its launch, Twisted Treeline, a 3 versus 3 map, was marketed and showcased just as heavily as the regular standard game mode in the hopes of finding a way to distinguish the difference between League of Legends and the original mod it was born from, Dota. The very first organized tournament ever put together by Riot was actually a 3 versus 3 event hosted and commentated by Freak in May of 2010. The idea of letting players use multiple maps was apparently something Riot had always envisioned, as just a few months later in September, they would announce what was planned as the third playable map and game mode, Magma Chamber. This first iteration of Magma Chamber was an interesting concept, as it was basically meant to be another 5 versus 5 mode, but with different terrain compared to Summoner's Rift, which would force players to change up their gameplay. More specifically, the jungle was a much more congested area with fewer pathing options, leaving less opportunities to gank. This ideally was meant to give laners a safer space to duel and therefore give greater importance on winning lanes 1 versus 1 or 2 versus 2. Riot had hoped that this playstyle would then extend into the mid and late game, as the tighter map design would encourage smaller fights until a match ended, rather than just one giant 5 versus 5 team fight to finish things off. What really caught a lot of fans' attention, though, was the concept art and design for this map, which looked incredibly cool and completely different compared to what they were used to on Summoner's Rift. It was clear a lot of effort went into this idea, which immediately got tons of hype starting to surround its release. But fans would be left in the dark from here onward, as after this announcement, Riot would give virtually no more updates for months and months on end. It wouldn't be long before League fans were still given a new game mode to satisfy their desire for new new content and a new way to play the game. That game mode, though, came in the form of an official ranked queue and ladder to properly rate players named Solo Queue. Players were excited to finally have an opportunity to earn a rating that could measure their talent and see how they stacked up compared to their peers, as before then, the only way that you could play League of Legends was through normal games. But after they got their hands on ranked, this is the exact moment when everyone found out just how frustrating League of Legends can be. Because solo queue gave you a rating that was meant to measure how good you were as a player, but that rating only reflected your wins and losses in ranked matches and not how well you performed, players began feeling as though their rating wasn't as good as it should be. A certain subset of the community, mostly in lower ranks, believed that they were playing incredibly well in ranked, but were still losing games simply because their teammates were terrible. This part of the community eventually coined the term ELO Hell to describe a mythical place where your ELO is so low that no matter how well you play, your teammates will be so bad it's impossible to carry them. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that this isn't true, at least not 100%. ELO Hell doesn't exist. While League players may have individual games ruined by a person intentionally feeding in a match here or there, in the long run, a player will always win more games than they lose and rise to higher rating if they really are skilled enough to deserve it. Some of the first videos I ever made on this channel 8 years ago tried to explain a few of these concepts because back then it was a really hotly debated subject. A lot of people believed that solo queue wasn't a good representation of skill and had little correlation to a player's talent. I mean, it's easy to see why someone might feel that way in a given moment. We all have games, even today, where we feel like the only reason we lost was because some idiot on our team didn't want to win. But back in those early days of League, that idea almost turned into a movement in search of finding a better way to measure player talent. One of the solutions the community came up with was 1v1 tournaments. Most competitive events in general at the time weren't Riot-sanctioned events, but rather independent tournaments hosted by websites like ESL and SoloMid.net. Because of this, the community had a pretty large amount of pull when it came to the kinds of events being run. Like, if a small dedicated group of players really wanted to set up a 1v1 tournament, it would get set up and have plenty of entrants ready to compete. Most of these events didn't have much in terms of prize money, but just the promise of competing for a title, like most skilled 1v1 player, got plenty of people willing and ready to fight. Now, like any community-run event, these 1v1 tournaments were pretty far off from being perfect, as they had some massive flaws. They'd be played on Summoner's Rift, with both competitors running down mid lane to do the actual 1v1 fight, but because Summoner's Rift has two other lanes that just naturally push with minions, you would occasionally have matches where an outer lane might push far enough that it takes a tower, giving a bit of an unfair global gold advantage to one side. The more serious and professional tournaments would literally have to have 2 extra players on each team sitting in the outer lanes to prevent this from happening. Even with their apparent flaws, these events had a lot of hype in League's early years, the most prestigious of which were the solo mid 1v1s, as top pros would enter here alongside random solo queue players fighting for first place. These pros didn't just enter though, they would always rise to the top, getting high placings, which further suggested to the community that 1v1 play might actually be one of the best ways to accurately measure players' skill. Documentation of many of these early events seems to be a loss to history, but from what I can gather, the most popular of all of them was the Solo Mid 1v1 Open in 2011. There, we saw more than 1,000 entrants, which might have been so many players, it got Riot's attention. Meanwhile, at Riot HQ, the company had started to hold regular events within their staff called the Thunderdome, where they challenged their developers to split up into teams and then gave each team 48 hours to complete a project, be it a game, map, or internal tool for Riot's development staff. During one of these Thunderdome events, one team began designing a 1 vs 1 and 2 vs 2 map that caught the interest of some of the higher-ups at Riot. Before long, along, this idea and design was turned into a full-fledged, larger project as Riot seemed to commit to the idea of bringing a 1v1 game mode to League of Legends. While the team got to work on this untitled 1v1 project, Riot was busy rolling out their third game mode and map, Dominion. This new game type was a territory-style game where players battled to capture and control certain points across an area named the Crystal Scar. Surprisingly enough, Dominion was actually the final product that came from the original Magma Chamber design, which had been tweaked and reworked so much that it had turned into something completely different. But that meant that all the old art assets and the name Magma Chamber was currently going unused. That is, until someone got the idea to apply them to this new 1v1 project. That gave everyone what would come to be widely known and hyped as Magma Chamber, a map that fans might actually get. Quick little side note here. At almost the exact same time this Thunderdome team started working on Magma Chamber, another Thunderdome team started work on a very similar project for another community game mode, ARAM. League of Legends didn't have much in terms of fan-created game types, but there was one very popular one named All Random All Mid, otherwise known as ARAM. This was played by players loading up into a custom game on Summoner's Rift, but rather than play the match out as normal, they would pick all random champions and then just run down mid lane. You weren't allowed to recall or go back to base and buy, you just fought as 5 down mid until you died and repeated the process over and over until someone took a Nexus. ARAM had similar problems to the 1v1 tournaments we mentioned earlier in that RNG from outer lanes could affect global gold, and some players might not abide by the rules of staying mid or not recalling since they weren't physically restricted from doing so. The fan-created game mode had become so popular it caught Riot's attention, so much so that a Thunderdome team began working on taking the old tutorial map League used to have named the Proving Grounds, and they reworked it into a proper map and game mode for the ARAM community. They started by just polishing the map up a bit and adding a few features that they then did a little test run with, holding a closed tournament with all the old art assets, but that turned into such a success that they would develop it further into what we now know today as the Howling Abyss. Although these two maps are obviously very similar, Riot seemed to believe that they both warranted being their own separate experiences. While ARAM was obviously meant to intentionally constrict players to a tight area for wild and crazy team fights, the 1v1 maps Riot worked on seemed to have the opposite philosophy of having more open spaces, hoping to encourage creative movement and strategies. Even so, they do still look quite similar, which might be why Riot specifically gave them contrasting themes of fire and ice. Heading into 2013, Riot had nearly completed Magma Chamber and had come up with a rule set for how 1v1s would be played in League. Players were given 3 separate win conditions, the first to either take a tower, reach 100 CS, or get a kill would immediately be crowned the victor, and the match would end the instant they did so. Riot would test this out at the All-Stars 2013 event, as they labeled it a skill competition, and had some pro players play through a little mini tournament, seeing who was the best at each individual role. And this event gave us some really entertaining games.
Felt a little bit too short because he's thinking Stanley's coming in for it. Now he definitely is.
Well, Stanley's had a little bit of time where he still has Red Elixir. This is a very small window to go in for this.
He's going to go in for it as well. Shy taking a lot of damage there. He's the X-Bun Juice, and they're going to go head-to-head. One more here, and Shy gets it just about. He's going to win the game.
He leveled up to 5 just at the last few seconds used up there. Ignite went down on him as well. Now he's going to turn around and pull some damage of his own down on Toys.
And that was a really, really good trade. He has burned the Red Elixir already, though. Oh, he gets the knockup!
He's going to get him!
He's in trouble. He's going to go down, and Toys lures him in there. All about the damage that he can do. Shy actually going back into this one. This could be dangerous. There's a turret hit. Soa's in all kinds of trouble now. Uses the barrier, and he's going to get the first blood. What a move from Soa.
The 1v1 event proved to be a huge success. Getting to see the best pros in the world go at it in 1v1s, just like those old solo mid tournaments, was a really awesome sight to see. From the creative strategies some of them pulled out to get their wins, to just seeing the excitement and thrills of players' reactions, acting like they got their first ever first blood or something. I mean, we got to see a level of joy and excitement that radiated off the players who took part in these tournaments, and all the community was incredibly hyped, as Magma Chamber must be just a short ways away from release. Then some time passed, it passed and passed and passed, and then finally, almost a year after that All-Stars event, an announcement came: Magma Chamber was canceled. This came as a devastating shock to the community. A map whose name was teased shortly after League of Legends itself was released, and now felt so close to finally being in players' hands, had just been yanked away forever. That alone was enough to get the player base upset about this, but what really fanned the flames were the reasons that Riot gave for the cancellation. Now, according to Riot, they had two main reasons and problems that kind of came up with the idea of rolling out the map. The first was that Magma Chamber itself wasn't very optimized at the time. Apparently, the version that was running at the 2013 All-Stars event was really only possible because pros were playing the game on what Riot described as supercomputers, and if the map were to be used by a regular person's average PC, there would be a lot of performance issues. This left Riot with the need to commit a lot of time and manpower to optimizing this map for the general public if it was going to be released, which meant that if they were going to do that, they needed to know that players were going to play it, which led to the second and slightly larger issue causing the cancellation. Before this announcement, Riot had released a temporary game mode on the Howling Abyss called Snowdown Showdown, which was a 1v1 mode nearly identical to what was played at 2013 All-Stars. The first person to get first blood, first tower, or reach 100 CS would automatically win, and a lot of people played this at first as it was a really fun way to test out the new 1v1 system, but the mode didn't have a lot of staying power. It was only playable for a few weeks anyway, so the community didn't sink a lot of time or effort into it beyond a certain point. But apparently Riot was using this event as a way to gauge player interest in a 1v1 game type. That's why they shut it down. After about a week of Snowdown Showdown being live, less than 1% of players' game time spent playing League of Legends was spent in Snowdown Showdown doing 1v1s, and that was the ultimate reason that Riot canceled Magma Chamber. That's right. The only reason that Magma Chamber was canceled, and the reason why we don't have a ranked 1v1 ladder in League of Legends today, is just players didn't spend enough time appreciating a temporary 1v1 game mode. This was something that got a lot of people really upset for so many different reasons. Firstly, Snowdown Showdown didn't have a reason for people to continue playing it after a week. There was no ranked ladder, which was the big reason why a lot of people wanted to play 1v1s in the first place, to test out their skill. And with no permanence to the mode, there also wasn't really a reason for serious players to try and delve into the game type to try and develop specific strategies or tactics for the mode. The community thought it was just a teaser for an upcoming project, Magma Chamber, so they treated it as such. Moreover, Snowdown Showdown 1v1s were really short, maybe lasting 2 to 5 minutes in most games. The fact that Riot was measuring how long players spent playing the mode compared to Summoner's Rift seemed like an entirely unfair way to judge enthusiasm for it. A single match on Summoner's Rift can run from 30 to 60 minutes. Of course, players are going to be spending more time in-game on Summoner's Rift. When that mode takes so long to finish out a match, it will naturally have more game time being spent playing it. You'd have to play like 20 Snowdown Showdown 1v1s to equal the time of a single 5v5 game on Summoner's Rift. But would you say that someone who queues 20 times for 1v1s and then plays one game of Summoner's Rift cares about those two game modes equally? A huge amount of the player base had a lot of backlash for this, as content creators made videos about it. I mean, the player base really tried to voice their displeasure at this cancellation, but nothing would come of it. To this day, some 10 years after Magma Chamber's original announcement, the game mode still eludes us and will likely never make it into the hands of players. You know, for what it's worth though, Riot might have been right about this one. 1v1s are still possible to play today, just on Howling Abyss instead of Magma Chamber. Some of the bells and whistles that are on Howling Abyss, like the brushes, the longer lanes, and the health packs, might actually make the mode more dynamic if someone were to run a community-driven 1v1 tournament on there, and we still get to see pros duel it out here at all-star events pretty much every year. It's probably worth mentioning, Riot was right about the player base not having much interest in game modes or maps other than regular 5v5 League of Legends on Summoner's Rift. Every new permanent game mode that they had introduced over the years, from Twisted Tree Line to Dominion to the reworked Twisted Tree Line, they would all eventually be removed from the game. The only non-normal game modes we have today are placed into a rotating queue, since whenever players are given access to any of these game types, interest always seems to die out a week or so after playing it. The novelty just seems to wear off for League of Legends players, so maybe the novelty of 1v1s would have worn off too if we did get Magma Chamber. But even so, some players still clamor for a 1v1 queue and ranked ladder even to this day. Ever since 2014, there's never been a game mode, temporary or otherwise, where players can queue up in a 1v1 or 2v2 setting to try and prove their talent. As much as we may know now that solo queue in Summoner's Rift does accurately measure skill for the most part, it's hard to deny. It actually would have been really fun to have a place where we could go and settle disagreements, prove who's better head-to-head, and try to rise up an entirely separate ladder. But as long as Riot thinks there's no interest in that kind of game mode, the ranked ladder will forever elude the player base, and Magma Chamber will always remain as a legendary piece of content that the League of Legends player base just never got to try.